wasn't a secret German weapon. It was a wall map of Europe. On it, a cross-channel invasion looked clean and simple. Arrows from England, a push through France, and the road to Berlin. Roosevelt stared at those lines and saw something else layered over them. The ghosts of Gallipoli, dead men on the wrong shore, a disaster born from rushing a landing before the numbers were ready. The president's wheelchair made a soft rasp on the floor as aides rolled him closer to the big map of Europe. Eisenhower's assessments from London and George Marshall's memoranda were stacked in front of him, crisp, precise, merciless. The Allies needed a decisive cross-channel strike to break Hitler's grip on Western Europe. Yet every attempt to choose a date collapsed under the weight of details that refused to bend to wishful thinking. Training schedules incomplete, landing craft scarce and scattered across oceans, airfields in Britain still under construction, weather along the Channel unpredictable even on the best charts the Navy could produce. Meanwhile, German divisions dug deeper into France every month, pouring concrete into the Atlantic Wall. Roosevelt's expression, so often disarming and affable in public, here became something else, measured, grave, almost remote. He had lived through the First World War as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, watching reports from the Dardanelles turn from optimism to disaster. Gallipoli was a name he associated with brave men, wasted by bad planning and political impatience. Now, as reports crossed his desk describing experimental, amphibious training in the United States and the British Isles, that memory acquired new weight. D-Day, whatever it was finally called, could not be allowed to become Gallipoli with better cameras and bigger guns. In cables from London, British chiefs spoke of operations with code names like Roundup and Sledgehammer, sketches of possible landings on the French coast in 1943. On paper, they looked bold and clean, arrows sweeping from English ports toward Normandy and Brittany, armored divisions rolling inland, German resistance crumbling under air power and naval gunfire. Beneath the arrows, however, the fine print told a different story. Certain brigades did not yet exist. Shipping was assumed rather than counted. Air cover was described in language that belonged more to hope than to a logistics table. Roosevelt had read enough planning papers in his life to recognize when the numbers were being bent to meet a desired conclusion rather than the other way around. So the pattern began to form. Meetings started with hopeful talk of this year and before the leaves fall, and ended with postponements written in careful, non-committal language. Joint planners toned down their own optimism after confronting the raw numbers of divisions, ships, and aircraft actually available. Roosevelt listened, asked quiet questions about shipping tables and casualty projections, and then leaned toward caution. Every delay sparked arguments in corridors and cable traffic thick with urgency, and every argument, once it reached the Oval Office or the map room, ended in the same uneasy silence. Outside the White House, the war moved noisily across headlines and newsreels. Inside, the most important decision of the conflict slid, inch by inch, into the future. While factories roared and recruiting stations filled, while families pinned service stars in their windows and waited for news, the Germans tightened their grip on the Atlantic Wall. In the glow of the map lamps, the beaches of northern France looked deceptively simple. Lines of coastline, a few place names, blue water. Roosevelt understood that beneath those drawn lines lay tides, minefields, artillery, and the lives of men who had not yet left home. The ghost in the room was not just Gallipoli. It was the knowledge that one rushed decision could turn the entire war into a question mark history would never erase. The memory of Gallipoli was not an abstract caution. It was a wound that still bled across Allied councils nearly 3 decades later. In 1915, British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops had been hurled against the cliffs of the Dardanelles on the assumption that naval guns, surprise, and imperial will could compensate for poor maps and incomplete intelligence. What followed was 9 months of slaughter, 250,000 Allied casualties, and a withdrawal carried out at night so that the Turks would not see how thoroughly the campaign had failed. For a generation of officers, the word Gallipoli meant more than a place on a map. It meant landing craft stuck under cliff faces, men pinned on narrow beaches, and headquarters that discovered too late that boldness could not substitute for logistics. By 1942, many of the men now advising Roosevelt had either served in that war or been trained by those who did. British chiefs like Alan Brooke knew what it meant to fight on a peninsula without sufficient artillery or secure supply lines. Churchill himself, who had championed the Dardanelles campaign as First Lord of the Admiralty, carried Gallipoli as a personal scar. In photographs, he joked and posed, but in private memoranda, he treated large amphibious operations with a trace of superstition, as if the sea itself could betray the unwary. Roosevelt, reading these cables and recollections, felt that old failure pressing against the glass of the present war. The United States Army, by contrast, was still inexperienced in major amphibious warfare. Its officers studied landing manuals and British lessons learned, but aside from small-scale exercises, the institution had never attempted anything like a full-scale assault on a defended continental coastline. American planners spoke confidently of building an army of millions, supported by vast fleets and air armadas. Yet on the practical level, they lacked one basic ingredient: time to train for the most difficult kind of operation modern war had yet invented. Tanks could be produced quickly. Infantry divisions could be raised and drilled in months. The art of coordinating naval gunfire, airstrikes, tides, and infantry landings against fortifications took years. Meanwhile, Britain was traumatized not only by Gallipoli, but by more recent disasters. Dunkirk in 1940 had rescued an army at the cost of abandoning its heavy equipment. Crete in 1941 had shown how vulnerable islands and ports could be when air superiority was lost. Dieppe in 1942 had painted in fresh blood the cost of underestimating German coastal defenses. When Churchill and his generals talked to Roosevelt about peripheral operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, they did so with the reluctant conviction that a premature strike at northern France would invite a catastrophe the British Empire might not survive. In Washington, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall argued that every year of delay strengthened Germany and exhausted Soviet patience. In his view, the central fact of the war was that the Wehrmacht's main strength lay on the Eastern Front. Only a massive blow in the West could truly shorten the conflict. Yet even Marshall's memoranda acknowledged the missing ships, the half-trained divisions, the shortage of landing craft. Roosevelt, sitting at the intersection of these arguments, weighed the parallels. Gallipoli had been launched with hope and pressure. The invasion of France would have to be launched with overwhelming certainty. Every briefing that mentioned shortages of landing craft, artillery shells, trained divisions, escort vessels, echoed like a warning from history. Around conference tables in Washington and London, maps of the Dardanelles sometimes appeared next to aerial photographs of northern France, a quiet reminder of what happened when commanders asked men to storm beaches without proper preparation. No one openly declared that Gallipoli was dictating Allied strategy, but its shadow lay across every discussion of timing and scale. Beyond the psychology lay a second legacy: the geography of Allied commitments. The landing craft required for a cross-channel assault, landing ship, tank, LST, landing craft, infantry, LCI, and landing craft, tank, LCT, were scattered across the globe. Many already committed to North Africa, the Solomon Islands, and the Central Pacific. British and American admirals warned that no amount of courage could make the same hull land in Sicily and Normandy at the same time. Each request for another preliminary operation seemed to push the decisive one further away. In quiet moments, Roosevelt studied the production tables and shipping diagrams, seeing not just numbers, but the outline of a choice that would define the war. Whether to repeat history's gamble or force history to yield to preparation. The smoking ruins of Dieppe offered a brutal preview of what a premature landing in France would cost, an echo of Gallipoli rendered in steel and fire. On the morning of 19th of August 1942, Canadian infantrymen, British commandos, and a handful of American Rangers stepped from their landing craft into surf already raked by machine gun fire. The plan had been designed as a limited raid on the French port of Dieppe, a test of German defenses and a rehearsal for something larger to come. Instead, the shingle beach became a trap. Tanks bogged down on the loose stones, unable to climb the seawall. Smoke meant to conceal the assault drifted away at the wrong moment. German guns positioned on cliffs and flanks that reconnaissance had not fully appreciated tore through the attacking units in minutes. In 5 hours of fighting, nearly 60% of the Allied force was killed, wounded, or captured, about 3,600 men out of 6,000. Naval support proved too light, air cover too thin, communications too fragile to withstand the shock. Those who staggered back to the ships carried with them not trophies or captured plans, but a stark lesson written in blood. Landing on a heavily defended port without overwhelming superiority invited disaster. German analysts, poring over their own reports, concluded that if this was a rehearsal for invasion, the Allies would need years to be ready. News of Dieppe reached Washington quickly, though details were initially blurred by censorship in official communiques. Roosevelt saw beyond the euphemisms. In between lines about valuable experience and lessons learned, he recognized confirmation of everything he feared. Here was a small-scale version of the nightmare that haunted every discussion of D-Day. Troops trapped on narrow beaches, armor immobilized, the enemy able to concentrate fire on choke points known in advance. It was Gallipoli with radio sets and fighter cover, and still the defenders had prevailed. For the Canadians, Dieppe became a national trauma. For British planners, it was a harsh but undeniable teacher. Within weeks, reports were circulating that dissected every aspect of the raid: the timing of naval gunfire, the strength of German concrete, the behavior of tides on shingle beaches, the difficulty of coordinating armor and infantry under fire. To Roosevelt's eyes, the conclusions were plain. Any full-scale invasion of France would require not just more troops, but a fundamentally different ratio of firepower to risk. Beaches would have to be chosen for their approach routes, not for their ports. Artificial harbors would be needed. Specialized armored vehicles to clear obstacles and mines would have to be designed and tested. Yet delay carried its own costs. In Moscow, Stalin demanded the second front that had been promised in Allied communiques. Each month that passed saw the Red Army bleeding on the Eastern Front, while the Western Allies fought in what Stalin derisively called the periphery. Resistance networks in France waited for instructions, sabotaging rail lines and transmitting intelligence, but aware that prolonged exposure meant arrest, torture, and execution. German engineers, under orders from Hitler, poured ever more concrete into bunkers and gun positions along the Channel coast. Inside the White House, these competing pressures converged on Roosevelt's desk. The president received cables describing Soviet offensives and their casualties, British appeals to strike where the enemy was supposedly softest, and American production figures that promised much but still lagged behind optimistic timetables. The memory of Dieppe joined that of Gallipoli as a silent commentator on every proposal for an early invasion. Each time someone argued that boldness could make up for incomplete preparation, the photographs from Dieppe offered a rebuttal no one could refute. In the months that followed, Allied planners quietly moved away from schemes that focused on seizing major ports in the first wave. The new thinking emphasized broad beachheads, built-up logistical capacity from temporary harbors, and a level of preliminary bombardment impossible in 1942. Dieppe, though rarely mentioned in public by name, became a case study in what not to do. For Roosevelt, reading the classified summaries late at night, the lessons settled into a simple conviction. The next time Western soldiers hit the French coast, there could be no half measures, no tests, and no improvisation masquerading as strategy. The decision that seemed like a shortcut to Berlin would instead pull the Allies thousands of miles off course and buy Hitler time he desperately needed. In the summer of 1942, while Soviet cities burned and German panzers thrust toward the Volga and the Caucasus, Anglo-American strategists argued over a simple, brutal question. Where should the first major blow against Hitler's fortress Europe be struck? British leaders, still reeling from the fall of France and the humiliation of Dunkirk, insisted that the only realistic option for 1942 lay in the Mediterranean. The United States, new to the war but already thinking in terms of mass and momentum, preferred a direct cross-channel assault. Roosevelt found himself in the middle of this argument, balancing not only military advice but also political reality. The American public expected U.S. soldiers to fight Germans, not just Japanese, and Congress wanted to see proof that the nation's vast mobilization would be translated into action. Yet the president knew that a botched invasion of France in 1942 could mean disaster on a scale that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor. When British planners came to him with a compromise, landings in French North Africa, far from the main concentration of German forces, but within reach of Allied naval power, he listened. Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, was the result. American and British troops went ashore in Morocco and Algeria under a complicated political arrangement that aimed to bring Vichy French forces over to the Allied side. The fighting that followed, especially in Tunisia, was sharper and bloodier than many had anticipated. German units rushed in to stiffen resistance, and for months the North African campaign became a grinding test of logistics, training, and coalition command. For Roosevelt, the reports were a mixed blessing. On one hand, American units were finally engaging German forces. On the other, the operation consumed exactly the resources that planners had once earmarked for an invasion of northern France. Landing craft that might have been assembled in British ports were instead hauling tanks to North African beaches. Carrier groups that could have covered a cross-channel assault shielded convoys moving through the Mediterranean. Air squadrons trained for coastal suppression were diverted to support the Eighth Army and the growing Allied presence in Tunisia. Every month spent pushing Rommel's Afrika Korps back toward the sea was a month in which the Atlantic Wall grew thicker. German coastal gunners gained experience, and the window for a relatively early invasion of France narrowed. Churchill, ever an advocate of attacking the enemy's soft underbelly, saw in North Africa a stepping stone to Sicily and Italy. Knock Italy out of the war, he argued, and German divisions would have to be pulled south, easing pressure on both the Eastern Front and any eventual landing in France. Marshall and many American planners, by contrast, worried that the Allies were being drawn into a sequence of Mediterranean commitments with no clear endpoint. Each success, Tunis, then Sicily, then the toe of Italy, created new arguments for pushing a little further, and each step further delayed the concentration of resources needed for the decisive blow across the Channel. Roosevelt saw both sides more clearly than most. He understood that the war was as much about alliance management and public morale as it was about armor strength and tonnage of bombs dropped. Operation Torch reassured Stalin that the Western Allies were finally attacking German forces. It gave American troops invaluable combat experience. It generated newsreel footage of U.S. soldiers advancing against Axis positions, sustaining public support for the war effort. Yet in private, as the reports of shipping allocations came in, the president recognized the opportunity cost. North Africa had not moved Allied armies any closer to Berlin on the map that mattered most, the one showing the Channel coast. By mid-1943, with the Axis driven from North Africa and Allied forces poised to invade Sicily, the record of Torch was clear. It had succeeded tactically and strategically in the Mediterranean, but at the price of pushing a cross-channel invasion from possibility into deferred promise. The Gallipoli ghosts, never far from Roosevelt's thoughts, whispered again through the numbers. Torch had shown how difficult even secondary amphibious operations could be. To repeat such a landing, against the heart of German power in France, would require a concentration of force in preparation that the Allies still did not possess. The detour had bought time, but not only for them. The invasion of Europe was not stalled by strategy alone. Its fate hinged on one of the least glamorous assets of the war: steel hulls, flat decks, and shallow bows. By early 1943, when staff officers in Washington and London spread their charts across long conference tables, one fact cut through the maze of plans and code names. The Allies simply did not possess enough landing ships to put the necessary men, tanks, and supplies onto the beaches of France in a single decisive stroke. Emotionally, many were ready to storm the continent. Industrially and logistically, they were not. American War Production Board reports, typed in dense columns of figures, revealed a bitter truth. Even under the most optimistic schedules, the shipyards could not produce the required number of specialized vessels before the spring of 1944. Landing ship tank LST, landing craft infantry LCI, and landing craft tank LCT hulls were already committed to North Africa, slated for future operations in Sicily and Italy, or earmarked for the ongoing campaigns in the Pacific against Japan. British yards were stretched thin, maintaining existing fleets and repairing combat damage. Admirals on both sides of the Atlantic warned that there was no shortcut. Moving a modern army across a defended sea required an armada measured not just in battleships and carriers, but in humble, boxy silhouettes designed to grind up onto hostile sand. Roosevelt absorbed these facts with the same quiet intensity he brought to casualty projections. The lessons of Gallipoli, reinforced by the debacle at Dieppe, had taught him that amphibious warfare punished improvisation. In 1915, troops had been landed in boats never meant for assault under fire, sent ashore on beaches whose tides and obstacles were poorly understood. In 1942 at Dieppe, even with better equipment, the ratio of firepower to beach width had been disastrously misjudged. Now facing the largest operation of the war, the president refused to pretend that courage could make a single LST do the work of two. Within the combined chiefs of staff, debates grew heated. Some argued that landing craft could be borrowed from other theaters, that shortages were obstacles to be surmounted by willpower and creative scheduling. Others, particularly naval officers with experience in amphibious operations, pushed back hard. A ship could not be in two seas at once. Each LST sent across the Atlantic to Britain was one less available for island hopping in the Pacific or sustaining forces in the Mediterranean. To assemble the numbers required for a cross-channel invasion meant making painful choices about where the war would be fought hardest in the coming year. Roosevelt listened to these arguments and repeatedly came down on the side of patience. He authorized increases in shipbuilding, reordered priorities to favor landing craft, and agreed to long-term production programs that would not bear full fruit until late 1943 and 1944. He understood that such decisions were politically risky. They meant telling impatient generals, restless allies, and a public hungry for dramatic offensives that the decisive moment would not come soon. But the alternative, he believed, was worse, scattering precious resources across many operations and then discovering, at the crucial hour, that the means for victory had been spent in fragments. Even the weather helped make the case for delay. Naval meteorologists presented studies of the English Channel that showed narrow, unforgiving windows of opportunity. Strong winds, treacherous tides, and sudden storms could transform a carefully choreographed landing into chaos. To risk such elements with anything less than overwhelming force was, in Roosevelt's judgment, inviting another Gallipoli. If the Allies had to wait for both the right fleet and the right forecast, then waiting became part of strategy rather than a mere absence of action. By mid-1943, the landing craft crisis had thus become a kind of invisible gate across the path to France. No matter how many conferences were held, no matter how many communiques promised eventual liberation, the cold arithmetic of hulls and tonnage could not be talked away. Roosevelt's caution, criticized by some as delay, was in fact anchored in this arithmetic. He would not send American and Allied soldiers into the teeth of the Atlantic Wall with too few ships to land them, resupply them, or if necessary, pull them out. The war would have to wait until the shipyards caught up with the ambitions of strategy. Behind the carved wooden doors of Quebec's Chateau Frontenac in August 1943, Franklin Roosevelt faced one of the most consequential strategic splits of the war. The corridors of the old hotel smelled of polish and cigar smoke as Allied leaders moved between meeting rooms, their footsteps muffled on thick carpets, while outside the St. Lawrence River flowed past in late summer calm. Inside the conference chambers, maps of Europe and the Mediterranean covered the walls, bristling with pins and colored strings. Around the table sat Roosevelt and Churchill, flanked by their chiefs of staff, each man carrying not only folders of plans, but also the weight of his nation's expectations. The First Quebec Conference was meant to answer a question that had hung over Allied councils since America's entry into the war. When and where would the blow fall that would open a true second front in Europe? Churchill pressed for continued pressure in the Mediterranean. Sicily had fallen. Italy seemed ripe for collapse. In his vision, Allied troops would advance up the Italian peninsula, knocking a major Axis partner out of the war and drawing German divisions away from France in the Eastern Front. Brooke, Britain's chief of the Imperial General Staff, supported this view out of hard-earned caution. To him, a premature assault on France recalled not only Gallipoli, but every failed offensive of the previous war, where optimism had repeatedly shattered against wire and concrete. Across the table, George Marshall spoke for a different America than the one that had hesitated in 1917. He argued that Germany's main strength remained on the Eastern Front and in the panzer divisions deployed across occupied Europe. Only a massive amphibious landing in northern France, followed by a drive into the heart of the Reich, could truly end the war. Every month spent in what he considered peripheral theaters risked giving the Wehrmacht time to recover, rebuild, and adapt. Marshall's planners presented timetables showing that with concentrated effort, a cross-channel invasion in 1944 was feasible, but only if resources were redirected from the Mediterranean and other secondary fronts. Roosevelt sat, as he often did, in deliberate stillness, listening more than he spoke. He understood the political stakes. Stalin, never shy about expressing suspicion, had been demanding a second front for over a year, accusing the Western allies of letting the Red Army bear the brunt of the fighting. Domestic audiences in the United States wanted to see American troops fighting Germans on European soil. At the same time, Roosevelt's mind returned again and again to the specter of an underprepared landing. Gallipoli had been launched on a wave of confident rhetoric and improvisation. He would not preside over a repeat of that tragedy along the shores of Normandy or the Pas-de-Calais. The discussions in Quebec were sharp but disciplined. Charts of landing craft production, estimates of German divisions, and assessments of air superiority were passed around the table. Naval officers explained in calm tones how many LSTs would be available by spring 1944 if Mediterranean operations were limited, and how many fewer could be assembled if additional landings in the Balkans or Aegean were pursued. Air chiefs described the growing offensive against German industry and transportation networks, arguing that by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe over France could be crippled, tipping the balance further in favor of invasion. The picture that emerged was not simple, but it was coherent. In the end, Roosevelt made a choice that blended boldness with caution. He agreed to Churchill's desire to maintain pressure in Italy, but insisted that these operations could not be allowed to derail preparations for a cross-channel assault. More importantly, he endorsed the planners' proposal to fix the date of that assault in 1944 and to treat it as the central, non-negotiable objective of Allied strategy in the West. The operation would eventually receive the codename Overlord. In Quebec, it was still a set of tables and sketches, but for the first time, it had a time frame and a priority that outweighed every competing scheme. For Roosevelt, the decision represented a turning point, not because it set a day on the calendar, but because it recognized that the war could not be won by peripheral attrition alone. The meeting's communiques left the details vague, but within the classified minutes lay a clear commitment. The Allies would gather every necessary ship, plane, and division for a single, overwhelming strike at Hitler's Europe. The president's long-held fear of repeating Gallipoli had not vanished. It had been reshaped into a determination to avoid half measures. From Quebec onward, delay would be measured not in hesitation, but in the time required to build the force that could make success on the French coast more likely than failure. Before Allied soldiers could cross the Channel, their leaders understood that they had to convince Hitler they would not. Out of that paradox grew Operation Bodyguard, a deception plan on a scale never before attempted in modern war. Its most famous component, Operation Fortitude, aimed to persuade German intelligence that the main Allied blow would fall not on Normandy, but on the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. This effort, which unfolded through 1943 and early 1944, was not a mere flourish added to an already settled plan. For men who remembered Gallipoli, where the Ottomans had eventually seen through Allied misdirection and tightened their defenses, deception now became a central pillar of safety. In Britain's fields and ports, phantom armies took shape. Inflatable Sherman tanks and wooden aircraft were arranged in orderly rows, visible to enemy reconnaissance. Wireless operators generated fictitious radio traffic for units that existed only on paper. A notional 1st U.S. Army group, supposedly under the command of the charismatic General George S. Patton, assembled in southeast England opposite the Pas-de-Calais. Double agents, carefully cultivated and controlled by British intelligence, fed Berlin a steady diet of half-truths designed to fix German attention on the wrong stretch of coast. Every successful message, every misinterpreted photograph, added a layer of protection to the real invasion force gathering to the west. Meanwhile, the armies that would actually storm Normandy trained with increasing intensity. Along the southern English coast, fields were churned by tank treads and boot prints as divisions rehearsed embarkation, beach assaults, and inland advances. Engineers experimented with specialized vehicles, armored dozers, bridge-laying tanks, flail tanks designed to detonate mines that reflected hard lessons from Dieppe and earlier campaigns. Naval gunfire support was practiced in live-fire exercises that turned remote coastlines into temporary stand-ins for French beaches. In airfields across Britain, bomber and fighter crews refined the patterns of strikes that would precede and accompany the landings. From the White House map room, Roosevelt monitored these preparations through a stream of cables and situation reports. The president's instinct for caution had not disappeared, but the character of his concern was changing. For the first time, the elements that had been absent at Gallipoli, a fully integrated deception plan, overwhelming air superiority, a massive and growing fleet of landing craft, experienced commanders used to coalition operations, were all converging. The nightmare vision of troops stranded on hostile shores with no way forward and no way back gradually gave way to something else. A recognition that, while the risks could never be eliminated, they were being systematically reduced. Yet uncertainty remained. In early June 1944, weather became the final arbiter. Meteorologists reported that storms were approaching the channel, threatening to whip the sea into conditions impossible for small craft. On 4 June, with fleets already at sea or poised in their harbors, General Eisenhower convened his commanders to consider postponement. The scene bore faint resemblance to earlier councils where bold plans had met the cold reality of circumstance. Voices argued for delay, citing the danger of scattering convoys in heavy seas. Others warned that waiting too long might reveal Allied intentions or erode the delicate synchronization of tides, moonlight, and air support. Roosevelt, thousands of miles away, received summaries of these debates with a keen sense that history was reaching a hinge. For years, he had erred on the side of postponement, insisting that no American boys would be asked to storm a continental fortress without the best possible chance of success. Now the very thoroughness of that preparation meant that delay had its own dangers. Prolonged waiting could sap morale, strain secrecy, and hand the initiative back to the enemy. The balance between caution and action, so carefully tended since 1942, had narrowed to a point measured in hours and weather charts. On 5th of June, meteorologists offered a brief window of improved conditions. Eisenhower decided to go. The order for the invasion was issued, and vast convoys began to move through the darkened waters of the Channel. In Washington, the news reached Roosevelt as a simple statement that the operation long discussed under code had commenced. Behind that statement lay the whole history of hesitation, preparation, and fearful memory. The ghosts of 1915, so long consulted as silent advisors, would now have to fall silent in the face of events. The morning of 6th June 1944 broke over the English Channel beneath low, heavy clouds, the sea still unsettled from recent storms, yet passable for the armada already in motion. From thousands of ships, transports, destroyers, battleships, landing craft, men stared across gray water toward a coastline they had studied on maps and aerial photographs, but never seen with their own eyes. The greatest amphibious assault in history unfolded not in a blaze of theatrical clarity, but in a mixture of fog, spray, engine noise, and shouted orders. Above them, Allied aircraft roared toward inland targets. In Normandy, German sentries peered into the murk, some convinced that the real invasion would still come at the Pas de Calais. Operation Bodyguard and its subsidiary deceptions had done their work. German intelligence, misled by false radio traffic and double agents, continued to believe that the landings in Normandy might be a diversion. As a result, key armored divisions remained out of position during the critical first hours. The Atlantic Wall, trumpeted in Nazi propaganda as an impregnable barrier, would now have to be defended piecemeal by units uncertain whether they faced the main blow or a feint. On the beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the collision of plan and reality was immediate and violent. At some landing zones, tides and currents scattered assault waves, delivering men to stretches of sand different from those intended. At Omaha in particular, German defenses remained largely intact when the first American troops waded ashore. Machine gun fire cut into the surf, shells erupted among landing craft, and the water reddened around floating equipment and bodies. Radio nets crackled with partial messages. For a time, commanders considered the possibility that one or more beachheads might fail. Yet the months of preparation demanded by Roosevelt's caution now showed their worth. Naval gunfire, coordinated with precision unthinkable in 1915, shifted to suppress strong points as soon as spotters could identify them. Engineers, long drilled in clearing obstacles and mines under fire, carved lanes through beach defenses. Specialized tanks and vehicles, though many were lost in the rough seas, provided crucial support where they reached shore. Overhead, Allied fighters and bombers kept German reinforcements under pressure, disrupting attempts to organize a coherent counterattack. Slowly, the attackers clawed their way off the sand and into the hedgerows beyond. In the White House map room, pins and colored markers began to move. Reports arrived with all the haste and confusion of battle, some exaggerated, some incomplete. Roosevelt, who had so often chosen to delay in order to avoid a Gallipoli in France, now watched as the operation he had postponed again and again forced its way into history. Casualty figures mounted, thousands on the first day alone, but the crucial facts were different from those of 1915. The beachheads held. Supply lines across the channel, though vulnerable, remained open. Each tide brought more men, more vehicles, more artillery. As days passed and the lodgements in Normandy expanded, the nature of the war in the West changed. What had been maps and projections became a rolling front of towns, fields, and crossroads wrested from German control. The long argument over timing and method, fought in conference rooms from Washington to Quebec, receded behind the reality of advancing columns. The decision to wait for more landing craft, for air superiority, for a mature deception plan, for trained troops, had not removed the horror of war, but it had averted the particular catastrophe that had haunted Allied imaginations since 1915. Roosevelt, whose health was already declining, lived long enough to see the success of the Normandy campaign and the liberation of Paris. From the perspective of those last months, the delays that had once seemed intolerable appeared in a different light. They were part of a calculation that treated human lives as something more than expendable counters in a game of prestige. The beaches of Normandy bore terrible witness to the price of liberation, but they did not become another symbol of futile sacrifice pinned to the memory of a lost generation. As evening shadows lengthened over the cliffs and sands where the invasion had begun, waves continued their rhythm against the French shore, washing over wreckage that would take years to clear. The armada that had crossed under threat of storm and fire receded into the larger story of the war's end. Yet beneath the statistics and campaign summaries lay a quieter truth. That caution, informed by painful history, had helped turn an operation of immense risk into a turning point of real hope. The ghost of Gallipoli, invoked in so many meetings and calculations, finally loosened its grip, leaving behind a question: how to balance urgency and restraint when the fate of nations hangs on the decision to move or to wait for just one more day.